Hi everyone, I'm Rosemary Gatter Everts with the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection. I've been involved with the whole effluent toxicity testing since the Clean Water Act was reauthorized in 1987, so I've seen a lot of renditions of it. And Kim just told you about the mechanics of the toxicity test, and I'm going to kind of fill in why, and there's a little bit of overlap and a little bit of clarification on some of the statistical endpoints. So let's see if I can get this thing to go forward. All right, so the objectives is why do we have toxicity testing? You people that collect these samples and send them to the lab every quarter probably want to know, how do we measure the toxicity? And then how do we measure the success of no toxic and toxic amounts? Now, no toxic and toxic amounts is part of the Connecticut Water Quality Standards, and it's a narrative requirement, and it's also part of the Federal Clean Water Act, as in fishable and swimmable. The electronics don't work too well. All right, come on. So basically what happened in 1972 when we had the Clean Water Act was rivers were burning, fish were dying, there was no oxygen, and the Congress said, okay, this is enough. Water should really flow and it shouldn't burn. So they came up with the Clean Water Act and they looked at the conventional pollutants and they looked at the factory, they looked at the pipe, and they said, what can we do to control the pipe and hopefully have happy fish at the end of it? It's going to take me longer to change the slides than anything else. Touch screens don't work for me either, so, okay. So there are conventional pollutants that you're all familiar with, were areas that we knew caused water quality issues before the Clean Water Act. BOD, biochemical oxygen demand. If you put this substance in the stream, it's consuming oxygen. That oxygen isn't available for fish. Total suspended solids, you could, if you have enough of them, you could clog gills, you could cover substrate. pH, if it's below 5, you're pretty much killing everything, and if it's above 10, you're pretty much killing everything because the biological systems get denatured at those pHs. Ammonia, you guys with the sewage treatment plants knew when we first started this program, and you put your fish in the beaker, they died a lot. And now with the ammonia treatment and stuff, we have a lot more fish surviving in the 100% effluent. Chlorine, very toxic. It won't necessarily show up on a toxicity test because it's volatile and it gets demanded, but it's also very toxic, and it's also one of those parameters that people don't think that they have. So when we started the toxicity testing, we said everyone does chlorine regardless of whether or not you think you have it. And then nutrients are back around in the circle for eutrophication, so they've kind of come back around. There's got to be an easier way. The other toxins that are mostly people familiar with, heavy metals, that would be mostly with your industrial discharges. Cyanide, that's pretty toxic. Organics, if you're an organic company, and microbial. So these all have fairly easy treatment. Metals would be flocculation and settle, cyanide, destruction, oxidation, destruction. Organics are usually what would be treated through your plant. So these are all conventional treatments. And we did this, and we looked back at the streams, and we said, are they fishable and swimmable? Have we met our goal? Is the biological integrity installed in our nation's waters? And the answer was, much better, but not quite there. So we're trying to go from being okay for fish to do swimmingly in the water. So now we're looking more at the water than the effluent pipe. So this is where I spend most of my life in the water quality standards, and part of the water quality standards say that discharges shall not impair biological integrity. So that would be if we go out and look at the stream and look at the critters that are living there, is that a balanced community? Also shall not contribute acute or chronic toxicity. Well, we have the whole effluent test that Kim was talking about to measure that directly. And then unacceptable risk to human health. And that would be based on bioaccumulation in fish tissue. So those numbers for certain parameters can be very low. Sorry about this, folks. That works better. Okay. So how do we measure toxicity? Kim was telling you a little bit about this. We put a fish in a beaker, or a Daphne in the beaker, and what we're looking at is we're measuring not just the conventional pollutants. So we're not just looking at the TSS or the BOD or the metals. We're looking at how they interact with each other. So we're taking into account an actual measure of your effluent and how it's going to be impacting that stream. So it's going to take into account synergistic effects, antagonistic effects, treatment chemicals. If you add polymer X and then you change to polymer Y, you might actually change your whole effluent toxicity. And as we like to say in the business, dead fish don't lie. This pretty much incorporates our entire philosophy. It makes it pretty straightforward to people. For the POTWs, now that we've had quite a few tests, the standard or best BAT number for POTWs is for them to be non-acutely toxic at the end of the pipe. We have tons of acute tests with our acute screening tests that show that there is no, or for the majority of the time, there is an acute toxicity. So it's a cheap test, you do it more frequently, and we keep trying to fend EPA off saying that it's good enough, we don't have to have chronic limits. We do our chronic monitoring, we use that to evaluate our acute test and our assumptions on that acute test. And hopefully we can convince them that we can continue just doing acute testing, but we shall see. The chronic test is required for some of you guys, and that's when the in-stream waste concentration is high. I had mentioned that our acute test relies on acute to chronic ratios. So we get to a certain percentage of effluent in the stream, and our math falls apart because we don't have people concentrate their effluent beyond 100%. Or if the stream is impaired for aquatic life. Now, a lot of you who've done the chronic testing, you do upstream, and then you do your sewage treatment plant effluent, and you dilute it out with the sewage treatment plant, and that helps us know whether or not the effluent is negatively or positively impacting the stream. For acute monitoring, which is what you do most of the time, we have an HRMR form that we ask you to submit, and every once in a while we find we're missing a few, so we end up back. And there's a part 1 to it, which is a summary of the sample collection time and the results, and you sign your life on it. Then there's the part 2, which is from the biology lab. So it's the part that Kim's lab would fill out, the number of organisms surviving, the test conditions. And then there's part 3 saying, okay, what was the chemistry like for that test? So on the first part of the ATMR, and this is part of what some of the field inspectors find out when they go out there, is you have to have the sample information. This has to be filled out, especially the sample collection time and date, because we won't know if your sample was set up within a holding time if we don't have that. We put it quite a few places in the ATMR, hoping that you'll fill it out somewhere, but every once in a while we get ATMRs that do not have this data, and then you get a email from me or a call from one of the engineers going, hello, when was that collected? The control information. Now, because Connecticut uses a Connecticut-specific protocol, that screening protocol, and we're only doing 1 test concentration and not 5, we have an extra control, and we have a requirement that each control beaker has to be greater than 90%. And that's because we're only testing 1 test organism. So to increase the power of that 1 single concentration test, we do that. If any of those are an 80%, you have to do the test over again because the test is invalid. The next thing on the form is the effluent survival. This tells you whether or not you pass or fail, and that's an average of those 5 beakers. 90% survival means you pass, less than 90 means you fail. And then you sign your life away. And a lot of the toxicity reports I've been getting electronically don't have people's signatures. Right now, I've been letting it pass, but I think in the future, it's going to be sent back to you to sign. So just something to keep in mind. Here's a comp of what the part 2 looks like. Sometimes when people double-side things and then mail them to me, they're missing one of the species. There's one for fathead minnows and one for Daphnia pulex. The sample collection information is on this, and then the sample time setup is on there, so we can double check and make sure that it was conducted within that holding time. The second section of it is kind of a summarize of the test conditions. So how many organisms, if we have mortality, does the first 24 hours or 48 hours, are the test conditions maintained? And then the lower part of that form is two things that are fairly important. So the controls and the survival in the controls tell us we have healthy organisms to run the test. The reference toxicant test tells us if the organisms are the same sensitivity as past tests or other tests. So we look at that reference toxicant data to judge whether or not the organisms are significantly or sufficiently sensitive. And then the most underutilized portion is the comment section. And for people who work in the lab, it'd be really nice if you filled out things like, oh, there's fibers, or the fish are swimming sideways, they're alive, but they're really not happy. Because if we have toxicity issues later, I can use that information to maybe help figure out where the problem started. And the lab signs the part 2 and the 2S because that comes from the biology lab. And here, people from here probably heard a lot of me saying, you need to be at 6 degrees C, your test is invalid because it's too warm, retest. So that's one of the things that we look at with this test arrival. We'd like to know when the sample was collected, but we also like to know when the sample actually made it to the toxicity lab. And another important thing in this is because of the total residual chlorine. Occasionally we will get reports on the total residual chlorine for your NPDES monitoring, which is a 15-minute holding time. And then we get the total residual chlorine that the organisms are exposed to, which, if it's a composite sample, could be up to 36-hour holding time. So a lot of times those two values don't match. And I used to call Kim or the other labs and go, you didn't dechlorinate the sample because you can't in Connecticut. We also don't allow pH adjustment. So basically the sample coming out of your pipe is the sample that's being tested. Conductivity is pretty useful for me, especially if you start having toxicity issues, because sometimes there's a change there. And then some of the part 2S's have an appearance value and some don't. All right, we'll go skip that. Part 3 is the toxicity, is the chemistry from that toxicity sample. It's collected the same day, and sometimes it's not filled out correctly. Sometimes there's parameters missing. So if you have your contract lab does the metals and you do the organics, you can put them on this form, asterisk it, and say, in-house lab. Please fill them out correctly. The other thing about this form with the new updated NPDES is we're hoping to have minimum levels on all the parameters. And this is simply because how we use the data. We can compare sewage treatment plants across the state if we're all using the same measurements. And so we can answer the question, is sewage sewage? And then because I work in the water quality standards, we can look and see whether or not there are compliance with water quality criteria or your water quality-based effluent limits. And then this is slides for Lex, who's not here. When she goes and inspects your facility and looks at the paperwork, she's found a lot of the ATMRs are missing certain things. The signature, which I already mentioned, sample date and information, and chlorine. Apparently, a lot of people have decided not to measure chlorine because they don't think they have it. But lately, we've been having an invalid test. So what would you do if your test was invalid, and what might invalidate your test? Sample temperature. So if your sample temperature arrives at the lab and it's 10, chances are you're redoing it within 30 days. Or within 30 days of me saying, please, I just noticed your sample was warm. Incomplete chemistry. If you do only half the chemistry that you're required on your NPDES, we can make you retest the entire thing. If you missed one chemical parameter, you call me, and sometimes I'll say, okay, for this time, but be aware that if the field inspectors or the permit engineers are looking for permit violations, that may show up again. So even though I'm okay with it and said it won't invalidate the whole test, it might, some other people look at it. Holding time exceedances. Don't see too many of these now, but that's where we look at the sample collection time and the sample setup time for the tox lab. You could have your test invalidated if the biolab has a problem where their test temperatures are not maintained. The sample, for some reason, consumes all the oxygen in the beaker and aeration isn't commenced. And then the other thing is a laboratory control. So if your laboratory controls don't have 90% survival, the test will be invalid and you will have to repeat it. And if you have an invalid test or a failed test, it's the same thing. Retest within 30 days, do both species and all the NPTS chemistry. You don't get to pick and choose like fish, the fish met the control survival and the Daphnia didn't. You have to do the whole thing over again. If you have a second failed test, then you usually talk to Kim or me or one of the permit engineers and go, we failed 2 in a row, we've never done this before, what do we do next? And same things that Kim kind of said. First of all, you're supposed to submit a plan to me saying you think you know what it is with the schedule. I don't get that often. And then in that plan, you have to have something we call confirmation testing, which is 3 pass tests after you solve the toxicity issue. Usually it's monthly monitoring in Connecticut. EPA protocol allows it to be closer, like bi-weekly monitoring or whatever. Once you pass your 3 tests, then you can go back to the quarterly monitoring listed in your permit. So if you finish your confirmation testing the month before you have a regularly scheduled toxicity test, you have to do that regularly scheduled toxicity test. If your 3rd pass test happens to correspond with your regularly scheduled toxicity test, you don't have to do another test till the following quarter. But so if you fail 2 in a row, you're doing monthly monitoring, so that's something that. And then what would we look at? Well, I like to go for the low-hanging fruit first, so I usually ask about treatment chemicals. Did you change polymers? Did your vendor run out of polymer X, so now you're using polymer Y? Was there a major plant upset? Did you have equipment failure, so you think you know what it is? In some instances, reviewing chemistry will show you that there's something that has changed. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there's pre-treaters. We had one at sewage treatment plant who failed their toxicity test because their freshwater effluent was turned into salt water. So when they looked up the pipe, they only had 1 or 2 possible people that could have done that to them. So that was a pre-treater. They going back into local limits, trying to figure out how much they could discharge, which would not cause this problem. And so we've seen that a couple of times. And if you haven't a clue, or you've exhausted all the easy ones, then basically we agree with Kim and we're like, okay, you need to do a toxicity identification evaluation. And there is one specially designed for municipalities. In general, it's looking up the pipe, making sure your plant operations are fine, your biological community is fine, look up the pipe, look for the major contributors, then you can do effluent manipulations. Now, in Connecticut, we use toxicity identification evaluation or toxicity reduction evaluation, and we mean the exact same thing. So we don't need to know that polymer X caused all your problems. What we need to know is that polymer X at concentration Y won't. So we need to know that you've taken care of the toxicity. We don't need to know specifically what caused it. And then the most important thing is I need a final memo or report saying this is what we did, this is how we solved the problem, we've passed our 3 tests in a row, and then we can sign it off as done. So for chronic testing, as I said, not all plants do it. It's based on in-stream waste concentration or if discharging into an impaired water. And the advantage of the chronic testing is for your effluent, we actually get a view of what happens to your plant over the course of a week. So we have a 4-day average. We know effluent variability, and that's useful. We get a kind of a picture of how you're affecting the waters that you're the receiving water for biological integrity, for growth, or for chronic toxicity. So it's a direct measure. For the surface waters, the 4-day average equates with the chronic criteria, numerical specific, and also the chronic test. So in the water quality standards and the NPDES regulations, you're not supposed to see any chronic toxicity except maybe once every 3 years. So we get a nice view of what the river is. I also use that data to determine whether or not our streams are meeting water quality criteria, which is why we need the minimum levels for both the effluent and the stream. And then when we do the mixture while using the effluent and the river water, we can see whether or not you're affecting the stream. If this was to go to compliance monitoring, we probably would go to using just laboratory water, so we could do the same thing. We could compare sewage treatment plants across the state. We have a chronic form. It's kind of loosey-goosey, so you can use this or not. This is the kind of data that I use to put into my database, the state database. Again, it has facility information, receiving stream. We did add a column for rain, because what would happen is that when we're looking at this data, it could be 2 months or 3 months after you submit it, and the chemistry in either the stream or your effluent looks really different, and you'd get a call from me or one of the people who are entering data and go, did it rain? So we put this in to prevent us from having to talk to you guys after the fact. What we do is we want the requirements of the survival and reproduction and growth for the test organisms, and we put it for the lab, the site water, and the river. And this is basically just so you can see whether or not the lab water meets test acceptability criteria. If it does not, you have to repeat the test. If your site water doesn't meet test acceptability criteria, you're okay. That just affects interpreting the results. But the lab water is telling you whether or not your organisms are healthy. And if that kind of fails, then the whole test is pretty much invalidated. And you would have to repeat it. And then the effluent, I just do that for comparison purposes. We got a couple of data sheets. Each lab kind of uses their own. This would be for Cereodaphnia. You've got 10 organisms. You're looking at how many broods they have over the 7 days, and then you total them up, and you come up with an average number of young per female. For fish, for the chronic part, we have the survival part, which is pretty much a straightforward survival test. And then we have a growth part. Back in the beginning of time, we had someone do a chronic test, and they never did the growth part of it. And we were like, yeah, okay. So what we're looking here, again, would be the lab control, and then whatever concentrations you run, or site waters or whatever. And the statistical analysis, now this is where we get a little difference with the EPA. So EPA has a couple of software programs that will supersize your no effect concentration. In Connecticut, we always look for the highest consecutive concentration that has no effect. So in this example, even though the 100% isn't significantly different, you do have a significant difference at 50% effluent. Therefore, your NOEL, your no effect concentration, has to be under the 50%. It would be the next concentration under that. The reason why we see this sometimes is surface acting contaminants or polymers. If you have too much polymer and the 100% effluent, it's happy, it finds things to grab onto. When you dilute that effluent, it's looking for things, and sometimes that's the gills of the critters. Another look at this is the graphical analysis. The no effect level has to be no effect, and it has to be lower than the lowest observable effect level. So whereas sometimes the software will point out 100% fine, when I look at it, we look at see whether or not there's impact at the lower concentrations. So that's probably the biggest thing. Also, sometimes the statistical analysis will say no observable effect, but the variability in the test is very high, and if it's above the acceptability for variability, we'll sometimes call it an impact, even though the statistics don't show it. And this happens more frequently on the reproduction growth, or if you do the fecundity test, there's usually a lot of variability in there. And lastly, my favorite part of the toxicity test that one you usually hear from me is there are 3 samples collected for chronic toxicity. Day 1, day 3, and day 5, or whatever. And I need the chemistry results for all 3 of those samples. Usually what happens is I get the first day samples, and then I don't get any of the chemistry for the second day samples. So this table, sent to me by a helpful PODW, is a good way of making sure you have that data that you can send to me. Or just when you're sending the lab sheets, just make sure there's all 3 there. I pretty much talked over the omissions for the chronic testing. The newer permits require all of your NPDES parameters that you run on a tox test to be run on the effluent in the stream. The old ones, I think, look at total and dissolved copper, total dissolved zinc, ammonia, and TSS. So as your permits get renewed, you'll see that. When you're sending in the results, make sure that your no observable effect level is lower than the low observable effect level. And the IC25 is kind of a in-between type thing. It's usually equated to your low observable effect. And I'm going to kind of go this really quick. Whole effluent toxicity is pretty much what I want to talk about, but we also have what's called chemical-specific numbers, and sewage treatment plants that make up a high in-stream waste concentration might actually get a chemical-specific limit. And that's designed to make sure that the receiving stream doesn't exceed water quality criteria. So, let me talk about that. So to control toxics and toxic amounts, we've got the conventional pollutants, we've got the conventional treatments, we have water quality-based limits in some cases, we have chemical-specific limits, we have whole effluent limits, and in some cases we do the chronic monitoring. And the whole purpose is to go from a stream like this with mediocre creatures to a lovely stream with critters that trout like to eat. So we're hoping with these tools we'll eventually get there. Any questions?
So my question would be, let's say you did 2 consecutive bioSE tests and you had 90% survival rate. You might not think, oh, there's an issue, but is there a statistical significant difference between 90 and 100% survival rate?
No, not in the tests that you guys do. In some tests, you can come up with a statistical difference. And in that case, we kind of do the pragmatic and say, for an acute test, 90% could just happen from circumstance.
And that could be like a storm event or just...
Or just, you're handling the creatures, or it's, a test beaker isn't the most happy place for an organism. So if you get like 10% mortality, that really doesn't cause alarms. If I ran statistics on that, I could get a statistical difference that says that the 90% is statistically different from the 100% in the controls. But for our purposes and the regulatory purposes, we call it a pass.
Now, I think for a lot of the people that do the lab analysis or even interpreting the results, I mean, you mentioned that there's some red flags that like the conductivity and things. Would you be willing to share like a sort of brief cheat sheet of like if you started seeing this in the report, this might be like a cause and effect thing to sort of preempt us to be aware that something is slightly different, or is you'd rather not?
Usually I look at that when I'm entering the data, and if I'm doing more than 1 or 2 plants, sometimes, for instance, if your conductivity is normally around 500, and then you do a tox test and it's 1,000, I'm going to mark on my sheet high conductivity. Now, that might not affect you passing, but it might be something is totally different there. That's probably plant-specific. And it's something that I keep track of, but probably other people don't. And in my database, I actually have a place to put it. It's not actually on the ATMR Part 3, but you have to do it as part of your 2S, so I look at that. Sometimes the pH, when it arrives in the lab's a little low, and I would note that just in case in the future, if you do have an issue, I can go back and look and see how uncommon that was. Occasionally with chemistry too, we'll have somebody, all of a sudden they have selenium in their effluent and they haven't had it. Sometimes I'll usually reach out and say, oh, do you know where this came from? And that's just for in case in the future it does become an issue.
Thank you.
These questions next to the lab for the DEP guys. It's kind of a loaded question. It's related to min detect limits that are changes for mercury and arsenic, how that is playing out for the state.
Yes, okay, so minimum levels. Back in the olden days, I think it was 1992, we came up with the minimum levels that are currently in your permit. And we talked to the state lab and other people and said, what's your detection limit? Multiply by 3 for a minimum level. And then when one of our permits was being reissued, we had an intervener, a common person saying, these are really old minimum levels. That's like from 1992. Laboratory practices have gotten better. You can detect lower. Really, you want to have a detection limit or minimum level below your water quality criteria. So for arsenic and mercury are both based on human health limits. They're bioaccumulative. So their concentration in the stream has to be low enough so that the fish living in the stream that people catch and eat doesn't cause harm to human beings. And that's the other portion of the water quality standards. So there are different methods out there. There used to be ICMS, is becoming more common rather than just the ICP method. There's a couple of other methods. So this person pointed out that our values for arsenic and mercury were really not in touch with the latest science, so we adjusted them accordingly.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the challenges that we had with our facility was finding a lab to perform, that specific test, because we're down to the nanogram levels of detection. So at the state had any, and perhaps even other labs, if you've been getting any data as far as, go to this lab, or if you're looking for labs, specifically arsenic, I think we were finding that there wasn't any in Connecticut to run it at the level that was being set up in the permit.
Okay, the Department of Public Health has a laboratory certification program, and they can probably tell you which labs would be certified for that low level. I usually just, call a handful of people when we're doing stuff like this. But the Department of Public Health lab certification should be able to help you with that.
Thank you. No, I support the gathering of information for that detection limit and see the science behind it. Another one of the challenges is acquiring a composite sample that's going to be valid, where some of the methods, the EPA methods, when you read into the documents, it discusses, some of the things to avoid so you're not going to get background or other contaminants invalidating your test. And, right down to where they say if you have dental amalgams that had mercury in it, don't breathe on the sample. So it's, it gets down to some of the specific science, and then you're like, boy, this is a composite sample, versus wouldn't this be a grab sample? Because, we're talking about practicing clean sampling techniques and clean hands, dirty hands, and, we're doing acid washing of our equipment to to gather the samples to make sure we're not getting these slough-offs of accumulated mercury. And so it's an incredible science when you look at it at that level, and it's a challenge, to try to provide good information for the DEP.
Right, and also this will help you if you acid wash your sample containers that you're not getting anything but your effluent in them. When we do sampling for our toxicity test, when we used to do toxicity testing in the house, we would always acid rinse stuff so that we knew, and then we'd triple rinse with your effluent or the sample of the stream to make sure that what we're monitoring is your stream and not something that's sloughing off, because that could cause toxicity issues for something it's artifactual. We've had a couple of people that, were collecting samples and suddenly they were really toxic and nasty. Turned out they had 4 feet of sludge in the tank where they were collecting the sample. So we're like, okay, clean it out and then tell us how you're gonna make sure that doesn't happen again. But yeah, it can be difficult. For mercury and arsenic, the reason why we normally would look at a composite sample is because the human health criteria, and this is from a water quality standard point of view, so permit engineers might have a different view, is an average condition. So we want to make sure that on an average you're meeting those limits, you're below those limits. It's not an acute number where we're worried about instant mortality. We're looking at a longer term exposure. So the composite works. We do have some people that do toxicity testing on a grab. Usually it's smaller facilities or non-contact cooling water facilities that really haven't shown any variability in the course of the day. But yeah, it can be tricky, and it will be trickier with PFAS because the detection limits are low and the sampling requirements to prevent contamination with PFAS are going to be a lot trickier.
Thank you.
Lunchtime.